Welcome everyone to today's session where I am delighted to be chatting with David. David Chambers, also known as the Authentic Man, empowers men to create exciting and deeply connected dating lives, sex lives, and relationships that they long for by developing their connection to their authentic self. And this is big in my work, as many of you know, authenticity, integrity, alignment, attunement, all that yummy stuff. So, as a dating, relationships, and intimacy coach who's been coaching men for over a decade, you can imagine David has seen quite a lot of the range and scope of men's experience and what might get in the way of them forming authentic connections, and how their deeply ingrained responses and patterns may create this idea of who they are in the world that actually feels a very long way from who they want to be in the world. So David's work helps them restructure, if you like, that self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and therefore initiating greater self-leadership. I'm going to put the links in below as to where you can find David later. But David, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me, Steph.
Oh, it's a pleasure. We first connected on Instagram, and I do love Instagram for that. I keep saying this in my podcast lately and my YouTube interviews that I've made some really beautiful connections with people via that platform. And they're people who are rapidly becoming friends and whose work I would never have heard about. And I guess you would be one of those that I may not have come across your work. And I think the context of me discovering you was both through my friend Pat Diverley, who's doing incredible work in the world and who I've interviewed on this channel, and also through some of the Men Without Masks crew. So I don't know much about you and your background and your story, and I think that that's probably where we should start because it's often the most inspiring thing for people. Like, how did you get into doing this men's work, and why do you think it's so important?
Mm. Yeah, I guess my story would probably start as a child, probably go back that far because I think our stories always start there, right? And they having some impact. I grew up in a single parent household. My mum has four of us. I've got three sisters. There are very few male role models in my life. My dad, though present, not living too far away from where I did in London, wasn't really there in any sort of emotional capacity. He wasn't there in any way kind of support as a young man or trying to show a young man how to be a man or showing a boy how to be a man. So my mum then got remarried, and her last husband, they got divorced a number of years ago. He also was not much better, to be honest. He wasn't very interested in me. I have this real image of I was about 8 years old and they just got married. I think they'd only been married for about a month or two. And I went into the front room for football because probably about 3 months before he'd taken me to the park and we kicked a ball around. And that was like the thing my dad never actually did. My biological father never did. So when he did it, it was like probably it really did light me up, like, oh, he's going to be all these things that I want my dad to be. And I remember going into the front room that day and showing him the ball and be like, oh, can we go and play? And he very dismissively and very, probably was very tired. He used to work nights and was like, oh, no, not today. Another time. I'll let you know. And he never let me know. And we never did it again. It never happened. So I think as a young man, I didn't have any idea what it was to be a man. And I guess fast forward that into my early 20s, when I was looking at my own dating life, and I was looking at my dating life, I wasn't really thinking about relationships at the time because I was deeply scared of relationships. I thought they all went wrong and so forth. So I was looking at my dating life and I wanted to improve that. And like a lot of men, I stumbled across the book called The Game. I ended up doing some coaches in that world, probably meeting for the first time in my life, like a group of men who wanted to better themselves and were committed to bettering themselves in all aspects, giving each other feedback, having fun together, but also being quite responsible, actually. There was a lot of, our thing was like, we want to have fun with people. We don't want to take advantage of anyone. We want to bring people into the fun that we're having, whether we're in a bar, whether we're out in a park, whatever it may be. And I left that world and continued my self-development in different guises and different with various different organizations and books and so forth. And I took myself traveling in 2015 with my then girlfriend. our relationship slowly fell apart over the course of about a year and a half. And a lot of that was down to, I take full responsibility, to be honest. A lot of that was down to the way that I struggled to express how I was feeling, because I was so scared of upsetting her and hurting her, because I'd made a promise to her mother that I'd look after her. And then we broke up one day in a hotel in Sucre in Bolivia. And about 4 weeks later, I found myself in an ayahuasca ceremony for 5 days. And I say that's probably one of the most transformational moments of my life, those 5 days, because I feel like a lot of the emotional debris that had been kind of sitting, that was stopping me from expressing myself. I often use the kind of description of it is like, I had all this ash, you know, when a volcano erupts, the ash just settles in the land and stops anything from growing. Those 5 days, it's like it just swept all the ash away and was left with this grass that could grow. And I spent a lot of time connecting with people, but not from a point of wanting anything, just wanting to be curious about them. So I was really deeply in this stage of my life for about 8 months of just connecting and being really curious about who people were and their experience, and really moving past small talk. Because I think sometimes we get trapped in small talk a lot in various areas of our lives. And this led me, after that, I came home and I spoke to a number of my friends, and a lot of them were quite unhappy. I remember over the course, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks, I saw kind of 3 of my kind of best childhood friends. And, you know, they'd say to me, how was your travels? I'd tell them, go into grave detail about the places, show them photos. And then I'd say to them, how are you? How are you doing? And 3 of them broke down in tears just from me asking that question. And they told me about divorce, depression, unhappiness, loneliness, you know, even estrangement from family, you know. And I really saw in those moments that men are really struggling. Men are really struggling. They need help in various ways. And for a course of events over the next kind of year, a friend of mine asked me to start a podcast with him. We initially really focused on dating, because we knew that for a man to have a successful dating life, he would have to combine a level of authenticity with self-awareness, you know, as well as an ability to communicate. But a lot of the dating advice that we saw that was out there at the time was very much like, do this, wear this, and say this, and you'll have all the results. But we knew that that stuff would only get you so far. It'd get you through like maybe 2 or 3 dates. And then yourself would have to come out at that point. And ideally it would come out earlier.
And it's still out there, isn't it?
Yeah.
That kind of info is still out there, yeah.
Oh yeah, it's rife. And it's very attractive for men, right? Because it's attractive for everybody, but in particular men, because it's like a rule book. It gives you a set of rules, follow these rules and do these things and you will get results.
Yeah.
Whereas when we're talking about seeking your authentic voice, communicating passionately and openly and honestly about who you are, there's no rule book for that you can just pick up and start following. But the kind of rule book breaks down at a certain point. You know, I know some coaches from the past who coach from, say, the rule book, and they would only guarantee their clients that they would get dates and get phone numbers. They wouldn't guarantee them anything more than that, because they knew that at a point the rule book breaks down. You can't use rules to get you into a relationship and have a happy relationship. Whereas, you know, developing authenticity, the ability to communicate powerfully, and open-mindedness, you know, even regulating your nervous system, these things will lead to you having happy and beautiful relationships.
Yeah, beautifully explained. I've seen that message recently, actually, in dating coaches, big ones as well, who say, I can guarantee I can get you 10 numbers in half an hour. And you go, and then what? You know, for me anyway. Let's go back a moment there, because I think there's something really important that we should dig into a little bit, which is this piece about rites of passage and boys being shepherded into manhood, the same for girls being shepherded into womanhood. We typically don't have that in mainstream Western cultures at all. There's zero. You know, it's like girls who start their bleed and their moon cycles, like it's often very hush hush, stigmatized, taboo. And for men, because there's nothing so obvious to hang it on, there's still this kind of transition where without that support of what is it to go from being a boy to a man, and even more than that, how do you grow into being, let's say, a good man? And I don't mean a well-behaved man, but I mean a man that really lives from the heart. So my friend Graham, who works a lot with intimacy and sexuality, made a post the other day that was really lovely that said, how I make love in my relationships is how I make love in life. And what he was implying by that was that there is no separation. It's not like, oh, suddenly you follow that rule book that you're talking about and you go into how to date. This is stuff that we live by. So, what do you think was the kind of I guess the biggest influence for you in the absence of having those role models to find your way through that time? It sounds like it came retrospectively, but what have been your biggest influences there?
Yeah, I can talk about some positive and negative influences, because I think
Mm,
one of the influences I can't kind of shy away with was when I first started going to the gym. I first started going to the gym when I was
yeah.
17 years old. I'd just gone through a breakup with my first girlfriend, the first woman I ever loved. Um, and this was the time where I started to push myself physically. You know, before that, I'd played football and I'd played cricket and stuff like that. But the gym was a new place of being supported by other men. Some of them were much older, maybe, you know, in their 40s and 50s, men who could have been my father, in pushing myself physically. Now, that was a really positive side of it, actually. There were, you know, some self-belief and, you know, the banter and the fun and stuff that was actually around pushing yourself physically. You know, you can do this. Come on, you can push this way. One more, you know, that sort of thing that I see as a kind of part of the rite of passage. The negative side of it was some of the banter and some of the let's say the level of consciousness and maturity of some of the elders, you know, some of the conversations, particularly around women and about money and about success, for
Mm,
instance, I look at now and go, yeah, that's not the sort of level of wisdom that I needed at that time. I may have needed a group of men who embodied a different type of man. These men were just big children, right? But they looked like they had the things that were important. I'd say one of the most, another really impactful, this probably is the most impactful in my life, is that I got my first job and there was a man that I started working with. His name was Ryan. I'm still in contact with him. And he was probably, I was probably 21. I was definitely 21, and he may be in his early 30s. And he took me under his wing and really taught me how to do my job. I was a software tester. I started off as a
mm,
software tester and was for 16 years. And he really took me under his wing, teaching me the ropes, how to do things, pointing out my mistakes. But he also gave me a lot of life advice about finances, about property, about travel, about how to live life, you know. I always
mm,
remember him saying to me, he was like, David, look, you're going to start to make money soon. And he's like, don't do what most men do. And I was like, what do most men do? And he was Scottish, very funny, man. He'd be like, they just they piss their money up the wall on fancy holidays and women. He was like, don't make that mistake. He was like, invest in property, put your money somewhere so that it grows, so that it's useful to you in the future, because you don't need to spend it now. And, you know, I listened to him, actually. I listened to him. He gave me some really beautiful advice. He really took me under his wing, really looked after me. For about 3 years, we worked together, you know, and I really looked up
mm,
to him. And I didn't realize how much of an impact that had until I got into later life.
mm,
Other
mm,
rites of passage, you know, I've been lucky enough. I've been on the Men Without Moss with Craig and the team. That's a beautiful experience, being with elder men who hold you in a
mm,
certain regard, who listen to you and challenge you to being better. That's also been a quite impactful part of my journey. And as I said, I think the ayahuasca ceremonies as well, being with the shamans there.
mm,
You know, the retreat that I went to was really beautifully organized. They had nurses and doctors on site. They had a couple of 2 or 3 shamans that I spoke to during the time, through a translator, asking me about my life, what I wanted for my life, where I was going, and would dispense little bits of wisdom and advice. So I think that those are some of the most impactful ones. But I do see it's
mm.
very much missing for young men, this kind of rites of passage. And what's missing most, I think, is just elders, people who are older
Yeah.
and wiser for them to look up to, not just really just
Mm.
older, but also wiser.
You know, I mean, there's things in there straight away that I want to respond to because and I want to circle back at the end of this reflection with a question. But I think because we live in a society, eh, as well as not having rites of passage, we don't value elders. They're kind of infantilized. They're kind of relegated to your life's done now, you're not cool anymore. There's this arrogance of kind of the value that we place on youth, which we can see in kind of, for women, the beauty industry, and in men for that kind of, the aspiration of being, gorgeous all the time. And once you've stopped being a young man, you still get the chance to be a silver fox, and it's still about allure and seductivity and all that kind of thing. But so there's that comes in. But what I love here is that you pointed to the fact that sometimes these aspects of mentorship can come in unexpected places. So there you are working in your software job with a man who's your boss, but who's throwing in these little nuggets of wisdom. So I really want to say to people listening, be open to where this guidance can come from. But then again, also coming back to kind of like some of your journey in particular, like, why do you think that culture that you saw, that you named in the locker room, for example, in the fitness spaces, was all about banter and all about, kind of women and status and nice watches and nice cars? Like, what is it that creates that, especially for men, because that's what we're talking about now?
I guess it's the way society's been set up for a long time, right?
Mm.
It's something that I was talking to someone about, is like, we almost live in these kind of two worlds. No, not parallel worlds, they're on the spectrum. And on one side, you have people who are living out of trauma and patterns, reliving the problems of the past and so forth, and have no awareness of it. They just think this is how the world is. And there's, on the other end of the spectrum, are people who are doing the healing work, that are seeing that the way that they may have been brought up, the messages they got that are not useful or good for them in the long term, and they're doing the healing work. And I won't say they're healed, because they're not, but they're doing the work to communicate better, understand the world better, be more compassionate. But most of society sits over here on this side, right? Where we look at the world as like, everything's about money and status. And when I get money and I have status, I'll be happy, especially for men. We, as men, we live in with these very narrow band of rules that we have to be a good man, to be a man who's accepted by his peers. We have to live through, we have to have the status, we have to have money, we have to be strong, we have to be dominant, we have
Provide,
to
protect.
provide,
Yeah.
conquer women, and all these things. And also a couple of those are like, never talk about anything deep, and don't show any emotion. Emotion is weakness. Those are the rules they kind of live by. And when I look at the
I've
kind of
seen that,
locker,
yeah.
the locker room of the gyms, I'm like, well, that's what was going on there, and that's what still goes on there, And out of that, men are vying for status through banter and conversation and talking about conquest and the things they're buying, the cars they have, the watches they have, the trainers they have, all these. They're just vying for status. And if you grow up in that world, you think that is how the world is, because you see the world through that lens. And I get quite a few men come to me in this way. They're like, well, either they're dating or they're in relationships, and like, well, this is how the world is. And I'm like, no, that's how you see the world. So that's what you experience of the world. But there's other different parts of the world that are very different from that. And often for men, it's the first thing is to acknowledge that this isn't how it has to be, and that we can move along that continuum, along that spectrum. And then our prospects open up. We're able to, we allow ourselves to express more. We allow ourselves to feel other people more and be more compassionate to other people. And then the things like money and status, they become less important, right? And then authenticity starts to become more important. The connection starts to be more important to us.
So if you were in that gym and you saw yourself as a young man sitting there in the locker room surrounded by all that stuff that's got to do with status and banter and the veneer, what would you say to yourself now as this older man looking at yourself as a younger man? What kind of piece of advice would you give?
I would probably just point out to this younger man that this isn't how it all is. That this is how these people and what these people here appreciate, right? And through their experience have got to this point. And just point out that there's other experiences you've had in life where the world isn't like that, where those things aren't so important, where money doesn't matter, the car you have doesn't matter, how much your trainers cost doesn't matter, right? And just point out that there is other perspective and other points of view, and that this is one, right? And it has, this is how these people are living, but there's others. Just so because I think that in many ways I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, not rabbit hole, but I went down a road in my life due to like growing up in poverty, not having any men around, thinking that status comes from money, good looks, women,
Yeah.
which took me down a path in life, which took me to a place where I was quite lonely. I didn't have
Mm.
this kind of the ability to create the sort of depth of connection that I wanted to. And then I had to journey out of that, you know. So if I'd known that that was maybe where it could lead to, and that's what it would feel like, I may have taken different choices and different decisions early in my life. Not that I regret any of it, because I think it's given me the experience and made me the man I am today,
Yeah.
because I have been there, you know, and I do know what that feels like. And I've kind of journeyed out the other side.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is what gives you the wisdom to have lived experience of what other young men or men in general might be battling with, because I was going to ask you, was there a period of descent? If you look at the hero's journey and we have to, make a step forward and then start gathering our allies, and then we have to go down and do the work, which is commonly labeled shadow work, or go into the abyss, or kind of meet those parts of ourselves, excuse me, where we're beginning to ask questions and go, well, there's good stuff. Like you said, there was some great stuff about gym culture. For just using that as an example, there are many other places in which there's kind of fraternities or brotherhoods that bring both positive and negative qualities. But yeah, so I was definitely going to ask you, was there a period of suffering and struggle before you came into finding the courage to actually say, I'm going to do this differently, or to speak out when you heard those kind of values being shared?
I'd say it was maybe a kind of step-by-step process. I think there's definitely a point kind of in my mid to late 20s, and I started to see some of the ways of being that other people were kind of embodying as actually creating the problems that they had. Um, you know, certain attitudes creating the problem that they didn't want in their life, you know, and I see it now with my clients, even now, where, you know, maybe they have certain attitudes towards women, for instance, and not
Yeah.
necessarily wholly negative, but just they have very fixed assumptions and opinions, and
Yeah.
they don't see that those opinions are creating the exact outcomes that they don't want and that they're experiencing. So I start to see this in
Yeah.
other people around me in my life. But I think the big culmination came for me during that breakup when I was in Bolivia, and I really was like, this has to stop. I want to change. I want my life to be different. I want to have a different outcome, you know, because up until, you know, maybe 4 years previous to that, I don't think I really believed relationships could work. And I think what was beautiful about that relationship that ended is it gave me the, not say the blueprint, but the understanding of myself that I could be in a relationship that functioned well, but there were still
Mm.
aspects of myself that would drag a relationship into the mire. Um,
Right.
and that was a lot around my own emotional expression. Some of it was to do with my own, you know, feelings of worthiness and so forth. And
Mm.
that really was like, something needs to change. And
Mm.
that was probably the big right turn for me in my life, especially from a kind of relational point of view.
I love that, David, because like I hear this a lot. I hear women sharing if they're in heterosexual relationships. I'm pointing to here, but I hear women saying that one of the things that breaks them up or that impacts the relationship is their partner's lack of capacity to be emotionally literate and vulnerable. And as you say, you've been programmed and trained into not being that. So when I look at these like online sessions where there's little snippets being shown of Men Without Masks, for example, and Mankind Project and other things like that, which are to a great extent, I see them as almost like mystery schools for men, because it's like, you go in and you're doing these ceremonies in these rituals that provide those rites of passage that allow people to break out. And I want to rest for a moment with that piece that you said, because I think people need to hear this. You, in that moment, in that hotel room, had the recognition that you wanted to do things differently and that you wanted change. And I really want people to hear that I've always said that awareness is the first step to change, because we can't see what we can't see. If we don't know what we're doing and we don't know what the patterns are that we're creating, like you said, you're seeing it in your clients, it's very difficult to change it. But on some level, there is this sense of dissatisfaction and yearning and longing for something to be different. So, okay, so somebody comes to you now in the work that you do now. You work one to one and in groups, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So what would they come to you for, David? How will they find you? What kind of things are they saying to you? Help me with dot dot dot.
Mm. So most men find me usually through social media or through my podcast.
Mm,
And there's a range. So, on the dating side, it's like, I'm struggling to create deep and meaningful connection, or I keep going on a number of dates with somebody, but it always ends up in that it goes nowhere.
mm,
Or for instance, they may not be able to get dates. That's also something that comes my way as well. There might be men in relationship and they're struggling again with the deep and meaningful connection with their partner. They're in conflict a lot. They're unable to feel that they can be their authentic self in their relationship. Maybe they feel that their partner doesn't listen to them and hear them and understand them. Maybe there's some intimacy issues, intimacy mismatches, or an inability to create intimacy inside the relationship,
mm,
sexual intimacy in particular.
mm.
The emotional intimacy comes with, communication as well. So those are kind of the standard ones. And there's probably one more type of issue a lot of men come to me is around leadership, where that's
Right.
self-leadership, being able to lead their own life, confidence. I kind of put it all under self-leadership, the ability to forge their path, find their purpose, that kind of what I kind of in my world, I label it as a kind of that lack of masculine energy, or the lack of ability to engage in their own, potential of masculine energy. So those are the kind of common parts that men come to me looking for help with.
I'm gonna say this is slightly contentious. One of my good friends recently went, I'm so done with all these men primal screaming but not knowing how to talk to me on a
Mm.
ground level. So how do and the opposite is true for women who get, very much into kind of more of the goddess culture and kind of really accepting the femininity, and then don't know how to bring that through into relationships in pragmatic, connected, healthy ways. So there can still be that sense of bravado or pretending. And it's like, I feel that, multi-gendered across the board, we have to break through that veneer. Um, and maybe you've got something to say on that, but what I'd really love to hear from you as well, because we talked about this a little bit before we went live, is men and race. Do you see that there are particular traits within the cultures that you've grown up in, or for men of color, black men, other men from different races, that are typically seen as kind of marginalized communities, or who've experienced a lot of backlash because of their color and their race and their identity? How does that influence the men that come to you and what you've seen? Big question.
Massively. Yeah, big question, but it's actually, about, I think over the last 3 years, at least 50% of my clients have been men of color, black men,
Yeah.
African men, South Asian men, quite commonly actually Muslim men, Hindu men. And has a massive influence, massive, because it's how we think the world sees us. I grew up in the 90s in East London. I remember watching the news a lot. My mum loves watching the news. And what I saw in the news was black men committing crime, not necessarily committing crime, but being like on the news for committing crime. So the message I got as a young man was like, black men are criminals. I was like, no, I don't want to be a criminal. I don't want to be aggressive. But, those are all the messages I got. If we go back to some of the movies we see in the 90s as well, often the fighting, the villains, black men, so that message for me was like, I don't want to be dangerous, right? So I'm a very, I might be, 6 foot and like 90 kilos, but I'm also incredibly gentle, right? But some of the messages we also get in our own culture, Jamaican culture, for instance, I think is very sexualized culture. It's also highly religious in this very strange way, in my opinion. So we kind of take that messaging into us, that way of being, You know, for a lot of Black men, it's you should be kind of hyper masculine. You know, you should be this virile sex beast almost. You know, that's how often a lot of
Yeah.
Black men feel they should be
Okay.
to be seen. And then I've got a lot of kind of South Asian men who feel like the world doesn't really take them seriously as men, that sees them as like, you know, soft IT guys, that people can't see them as being attractive or being, you know, sexually interesting and stuff like that. So that's also
Yeah.
something that a lot of men, Asian men, deal with. Plus they have their kind of cultural, what should we call it? The cultural conditioning they have around marriage and relationships and love. You know, whether that's arranged marriages comes into play for a lot of them, or that they should marry and be with someone of their own culture. That's something that I've seen in my personal life, but also in my professional life, the pressure that a lot of kind of, what do you call them, first or second generation men from African backgrounds, Caribbean backgrounds, or even South Asian backgrounds feel they have to marry within the culture, but that doesn't fit their authentic being that they've grown into living in Western culture, living in the UK, living in the States. So they have this kind of resistance that comes in. It's like this internal battle of, oh, should I do what my parents think I should do? Or should I do what I want to do? And often I see with a lot of men living almost double life, a life that they show their parents and a life that they live. And this isn't just men who are like in their teens and 20s. This is men who are in their 30s and mid 40s who are still living like this because the cultural pressure of, you know, being a good son it weighs very heavily on them.
I really, really resonate and relate to that. And I think it's super important. And I don't think it's necessarily a quick and easy fix because, you know, when you talk about the cultural significance there as well as racial significance. And I noticed in that first group that you gave examples of people who come to work with you, you mentioned Muslim men and Sikh men. And so there's religious influences as well. So there's cultural, religious, racial, social, all this stuff, you know, going on. And even the examples that you gave there of Black men are criminals, I don't want to be dangerous, there's this hypersexualization, and you pointed to something about a strange sense of religion as well there. But I've seen this playing out again in my work with women, you know, particularly women from kind of cultures that are much more repressive about women's voices. And so
Mm,
what I see happening there, and I'm guessing I'd love to hear if it's the same for you, is a repression, a total repression of that authentic voice that creates this, it's literally like a pressure cooker, because this person on the inside, some people seem to, it's, you know, the analogy of put a frog in boiling water and it doesn't know it's being boiled. Some people seem to cope better on some level with that kind of restriction of their actual authenticity, and they just put it to one side and go, well, that's how it is. And then there's other people who just
mm,
go, no, that's just not right for me. And that goes across the board, I think, you know, beyond race, culture, social. It's like, you know, as a white cisgendered woman, I might go, oh, well, but I grew up feeling like the black sheep in my family, you know,
mm.
that, and my family were all within that culture. But just because I had opinions, it wasn't safe to speak out. Are there any particular recurring, repeated messages that you just want to add here so that people can get this sense that they're not alone, that you are seeing in your work? And if there are, what might those be? You've given some great examples, by the way, but yeah.
What you said there about you know, the cultural piece, the expressing our authentic voice. So many of us are indoctrinated into how we should be, and we
Mm,
follow those rules, we follow those patterns, and we express ourselves in the world in that way. And for a lot of men, that shows up as, you know, being successful in the way that our parents teach us to. You know, that might be, you know, getting the degree, getting the job, the house, the car, the wife, the next house, the next car, and continually doing that. That's something I see a lot of. And then men finding a point where they believed, they were told that all those things would bring them happiness, and it doesn't.
yeah.
And you know, I've
Mm,
met women through my partner who's also a coach, who had the same experience. They were like, oh, I need to be an independent woman, and when I'm an independent woman, then I'm going to be happy. And then they find themselves in this cycle where they have the great job, they've got all the money and blah, 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 but they're unable to create relationships. So that's another thing I see for men, is that we don't teach men to value connection. We teach them to
Mm.
value production, right? And that a man's value is only good as his production. So it means that
Mm.
men don't value friendship. They don't value
Mm.
relationship, depth in relationship, the connection of relationship, even intimacy, like real intimacy, not just sex and bodies, but real deep
Yeah.
intimacy. So the thing I see for men most commonly is often they're still living by their parents' rules. And that goes cross-culture as well. Living by the way their parents think they should live. That can be really detrimental, because my belief is at some point a young man and a young girl need to rebel against their parents' ideals and ideas, because they have to take things further. We have to evolve beyond that. Men aren't taught the art of intimacy and connection. This is a really reoccurring theme, and that can be emotional intimacy, like creating deep emotional intimacy, being with someone else's emotion, being with our partner's sadness or happiness or joy, and being able to just be with that and hold that, like, oh, she's sad. That's okay. I can listen to the words. I can hear what she's saying. I can hear the emotion. A lot of men want to instantly get rid of the sadness and replace it with a solution, or remove the emotion and just get down to the facts. Or they struggle
Yeah.
with like real intimacy, like connecting and creating that intimacy in their relationships. They're not relationships at a very surface level, because they've done the work to create the production and housing and stuff. And then often also men feeling like they're in relationships, marriages in particular, and they've ticked all the boxes. Like, their wife has a lovely, safe life, they've got kids, like everyone's financially provided for, blah, blah, blah. But their partner's not happy. And they're like, why? I don't understand why my partner's not happy. They expect too much and blah, blah, blah. And
Yeah.
when they come to me, I'm like, no, all you've done is give her stuff. She wants to feel you.
Yeah.
Nearly all the men I work with are heterosexual men in heterosexual relationships. It's like, she wants to feel you. She wants more than what your grandmother had. Your grandmother wanted more, but she didn't know she was allowed to ask for it. We're in a world now
Yeah.
where, women, they don't need men. They don't need a man to live their life and keep them safe. They can make their own money. They can buy their own homes. They can get their own jobs. So now I with the men I work with, is like, the production isn't enough. It isn't even that important, actually. I tell men this all the time, like, don't be obsessed about the money side of things. It's like, because the woman you meet, she wants you to take her somewhere emotionally. She wants to take her somewhere sexually that she cannot take herself, right? Not necessarily financially. It might be you take her on holiday, but it's the experience that you create while on holiday. So there's a lot of, I think the thing I'm seeing, my opinion is that womanhood and femininity has been questioned for, the best part of 50 to 70 years. You could argue 100 years,
Yeah.
right? It's been in question. It's been like, we're looking at it and go, is this what we want? And, a lot of women would feel that the femininity that they had, or even still have, wasn't designed by women, right? It was decreed down by the men of those times, on past times, religious books.
Absolutely.
So women have been questioning femininity for the last 100 years, and they're starting to design it in a way that's like, well, actually, we don't want to just be at home. We want to be able to work. We want to be able to travel alone. We want to be able to have babies alone. So it's expanding what's inside of femininity. Masculinity has only really started to be in question for maybe the last, 30 or 40 years. And even that, there's been a
You're
lot of
so right.
resistance, so much resistance. So what I do with men is basically expand their awareness of what's possible for them, and we start to look at masculinity and start to break down some of these rules of how I have to be and how I don't need to be. And I see that relationships and dating and intimacy really all sit on top of this idea of masculinity, because what's the first thing we start to learn as young people? How we meant to be as boys. We learn this as young, how I'm meant to be as a boy. We look at other boys, we look at other men for an example, which means we inadvertently inherit this traditional old school masculinity, and then we express it through our lives. And in particular, it really affects our relationships and our ability to connect.
Do you know, I can't believe that I've never really considered that in the way that, when women started fighting for the vote, when they weren't allowed in art schools, they weren't allowed to write, they weren't allowed to do stuff. Of course, that brought everything into question, which just carried on building momentum until we got in the feminism decades of burn your bra, and we got into free love in the 60s, which obviously was suitable for both, or was appealing to both. But I never really thought about how recent, relatively recent it is that this sense of what is masculinity has been called into question. And I'm so grateful that it is, because my work has a strong focus on actually breaking illusion in order to create authentic expression, and yours does too. So I want to say, what's something in your work that really lights you up, maybe in your life as well? What really brings you joy?
Mm. Um, I did a men's circle last night of a company called Men's Circle. Um,
Mm,
and the part of my job that I love is talking to men
yeah.
about their experience and hearing them and having empathy and compassion, because that's where I always start with my clients, no matter what they come to me with, no matter how, when they tell me the sentence of what's been going on in their life, how it might sound terrible to, most of the people who listen to this, I have a deep understanding and compassion because I understand how we make choices that get us into certain situations.
Mm,
So it's listening to men and talking to men. And I did I hosted a men's circle last night. It was around intimacy, around sex and intimacy. And what really lights me up is that when men are given the opportunity to talk in a place that they feel is safe, right, where there won't be any judgment, there won't be any critique, where they will be supported, they open up. They really do. Men of different walks of life. I've seen this time and again through retreats I've been on, men's circles I've been in, even one-to-one conversations I've had with random people at parties and clubs and stuff. When given the opportunity where they feel that it's going to be safe and be accepted, men will open up. And when they do that, then the opportunity for change and transformation starts to come in. But when men feel that they've got to keep their guard up, they've got to stay safe, they've got to protect themselves, they've got to keep on the armor and bravado, it's very hard for a man then to enter into the realms of transformation and as you said, like breaking down the illusion, because they're upholding the
mm.
illusion in their mind to stay safe, and it's realizing that the illusion is that it's an illusion, and they can make different choices and take different actions.
Beautiful. I mean, and here's a slightly contentious question. Do you feel that your background and your appearance, you obviously take care of your appearance, your clothes, your muscles, you're probably still working out. Do you feel that that means that you attract certain men towards you and towards your work who might make assumptions about who you are and how you are, but that they'll go, oh, this dude's going to understand me because he looks like I look. He's invested in the
Yeah,
same thing I'm invested in.
it's a very common thing I get, especially from men of color, actually.
Yeah.
I feel really blessed because I grew up in a part of East London that was very, very diverse. A lot of my good friends are Muslims and Sikh. So I spent a lot of time, not necessarily going to mosque, but talking about religion. So I have a real understanding for the cultural elements of, say, Indian and Pakistani culture. So a
Yeah.
lot of the men who come to me who are men of color, they come and they're like, I've chose to speak to you because you're going to understand some of my experience because you're a man of color.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
and I always find it really interesting because, I've got clients of mine who are very similar to me. Their parents were Jamaican immigrants who came to the UK in like the 60s or 70s. So a lot of the things that they talk to me about, I'm like, yeah, my mum used to say that to me. Yeah, my parents used to do that. Or some of my clients who
mm.
are Muslim and they're from Pakistan or India, they're telling me things. I'm like, yeah, I watched my friend go through that when we were 12, 13, 25. So I think that it does make a difference to people. But I think that what surprises people when they talk to me is just how much I just listen, like how
Yeah.
much I'm just here for them. I'm not here to kind of tell them what to do or how they should live. I'm just inquiring because, I imagine you feel very similar. People have wisdom. We have wisdom. It's just that we don't place ourselves in the setting where we can start to get in contact with that wisdom and start to make different choices and so forth. And I just try and make a space that also challenges men to be better and shows them an example of how they can be better and be different, especially if they don't have that in their lives. But I really want them to get in contact with their own internal wisdom.
Yeah, beautiful. That I love that you highlighted both there. Well, on the one hand, your relatability, but on the other hand, that people are whole and don't need fixing and healing, and that they have access to their inner wisdom, but sometimes they need those direct words of how they can do better. because, you know, it's like, it reminds me of times when I or other people I know have been to therapists and then stopped going because they've gone, well, it was kind of like I would talk and they would listen, but then they'd never kind of challenge anything I said. So I didn't feel as though I was getting anywhere. And I think that's how growth happens. We need to sometimes have our belief systems confronted by a well placed, well timed question, inquiry. What do you think about that? Has that been working for you? What would you like to do differently if you could do anything differently? So I love that you brought that in as well. Um, Now I realize, because we're coming towards the close and most of these sessions have a feature on breath in them somewhere, what relationship does breath have in your work?
Across the board. You know, like yesterday I had a coaching call with one of my clients. In the beginning, I just got a sense, you know, he looked a bit tense. I was like, okay, we're gonna do some breath here. He was like, oh, okay, what are we getting to? So I sat there in silence for a couple of moments and I was like, a bit of Wim Hof, you know, breathing, I think would be good. Trauma, as it should be called. And so we did. I went through, 30 breaths, held. And after that, I stopped him for a moment in a meditation of just feeling his body, feeling the moment, feeling his own expansive nature. And when we both opened our eyes and I looked at him, he looked at me, he was just like, oh man, I didn't realize I needed that, and that's just in my coaching calls, because I bring in the work
Yeah.
I do with couples. I do work with my partner with couples. Quite often we're bringing in breath in couples work to create connection, because people don't realize how dysregulated their relationship is from a physical level, nervous system level. So breathing together, with a little bit of maybe guidance from me over that, and embodiment as well. I trained with a guy called Jay, do some healing breath work. So helping men let go of stuff as well, open up their hearts, open up their minds, because we hold on to so much, and the breath is a wonderful way that we can kind of drop out of the thinking. Because there's, one of the most common things men come to me is overthinking. They're like, oh, I think about everything. And I'm like, hey, let's drop you out of the head and then start feeling the body. Let's start breathing deeply into the body, for half an hour, and see what comes to you then, how your body opens up, how your heart opens up, how some of those beliefs that you had no longer seem so fixed and seem so, the situations you're in your life don't seem as scary and as full of fear.
Yeah, well put. It's like, for me, dysregulated breathing is typically dysregulated emotions. And so it's kind of almost like you can't have one without the other. And so if we can bring breathing into regulation, if we can create space through presence, because the breath for me is presence. Like if I sit for a moment now with you and just tune in, we've been talking a lot. So typically breath becomes more shallow. And then it'll take me a little bit longer to go, okay, now I'm feeling myself. I'm not in my brain mind. I've been listening from a place of presence, but obviously I know more and more and more how to regulate my breathing, even when I'm in activity. So many people don't. So, yeah, just stressing the importance, if you're listening, of breath regulation, breath as a route to intimacy, breath as a route to connection and expression. The three keys of Tantra: movement, breath, and voice. Breath is there for a reason. You could have movement and voice, and you might be shouting a lot and doing a lot, but not feeling a lot. And I think the breath brings in the feeling.
Definitely,
Mm.
definitely.
Okay, so David, thank you. This has been such a juicy conversation. And if you were to leave people with one piece, the men who will be listening to this in particular, with one piece of, I don't even particularly like the word advice. No, let's say a gem of your lived experience. What
Mm.
might you leave them with as a little ding? Take this with
Mm.
you.
Something that I'm really talking about a lot at the moment is capacity. We believe that our capacity is much smaller than it is. When I say capacity, that might be our capacity to love, our capacity to deal with difficult times, our capacity to express ourselves, our capacity to feel. We believe that it's smaller than it actually is. And
Mm.
that is a thing that limits us. We talk about limiting beliefs and so forth. That's the thinking we have around our capacity is what limits us. And when you start to expand your thinking of your capacity, you experience a greater capacity in your life, whether that's, and it goes across the board, you know, feeling, emotion, success, dealing with failure, dealing with hard times. And I see it time and again with Ben. So I'm like, believe in a more expanded capacity that goes beyond the mind and what your mind is telling you that you're not capable of doing, because that simple idea can really be transformative to your life.
Well, I know I needed to hear that today. Thank you. I love, love this sense of I'm going to take that into my contemplation when I go down to my altar in a moment, just to contemplate capacity. What a beautiful thing to end with. And I'm going to make sure that people know exactly where they can find you. I'm super grateful for your time today, David. It's been a pleasure chatting. Thank you for being my guest.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure being here.